When I built this camper, I had an idea of what I wanted, but I didn't really have a good plan. For the most part, I just figured it out as I went. I did 3 videos on it. The first, I built it. The second, I added a heater and fridge. And the third, I made some major changes that really should have been done at a different point in the build. In this one, I want to go back and dive deep into the ways it could have been done better. Let's put some of the steps in a better order and show some methods that would make it easier, save some time and money, and cut some of the weight. So if you like this camper build and you'd like to build your own, I hope you haven't started yet because this video will really help. I'm still pretty happy with the frame restoration, but this is where I should have stopped and upgraded the axle and springs. The pop-up had a 2,200 pound axle. Now I did stay under that weight, but it was close enough that it didn't give you a warm fuzzy feeling towing it down the road. It was much the opposite, which with that nagging voice in my head saying this could break, you might hurt someone, change the axle. So I did, but it would have been much easier when the frame was bare. This would have saved quite a bit of time for the welding shop, which would have saved me some cash, and I could have used it worry-free as soon as I was finished building it. So my advice is when you're done with your frame restoration and the frame is still bare, whether you can weld or you need to have somebody else weld the new axle in, change the axle and springs to the next size up. Unless you're positive you'll stay at least 700 pounds under your axle rating. The reason I say 700 pounds is I was pretty sure I would be at least 500 pounds, and it ended up being not even 200 pounds under. I bought my axle and springs and mounting hardware from an RV surplus store, and I spent about half the amount of anywhere else, so keep those places in mind. The next thing I would like to point out is the floor. I used 3/4 inch treated plywood. It's going to last a long time and it's a good choice, but the problem with treated is it has so much moisture in it that you have to wait at least a couple of months before you can coat the underside. Otherwise, that moisture will be trapped in and can cause mold. Therefore, I think a better choice would be non-treated 3/4 inch plywood. Give it several coats of your favorite water coating before installing it, and avoid the misery of laying on the ground coating it over top of you. I built this little mini camper a couple months ago. For this one, I made an insulated floor, so let's walk through how that was done. First, I ripped down some 3/4 inch plywood strips, around 3.5 inches wide. These are for building the inner frame of the floor. You could use pine 1x4s as well. I laid the strips out on the trailer frame and screwed them to each other so they would stay in place. Then I used 1/4 inch plywood on top of that. I glued that and stapled it with 1 inch staples, flipped it over, stuffed all the spaces with 3/4 inch foam, and glued and stapled another layer of 1/4 inch plywood. And since it was regular plywood, I was able to put a coating on the bottom right away. For that, I used 2 coats of roll-on bed liner. Keep in mind, if you build an insulated floor, you will want extra framework wherever something will mount to the floor. I did put quite a bit of thought into laying out the camper. I looked at the height of the table and where I wanted to put cabinets before I laid out where my windows were going to go. But one thing I didn't think of was an awning. And there are some that might still work, but a lot of them have 2 support arms that mount to the side of the camper and fold out to hold the awning up. Had I thought of that, I would have at least got the measurements for one of them and added a couple studs for those arms to mount to. The next thing I would absolutely do different is build an aerodynamic front end from the start. You can see how I built it with a flat front wall. I knew it would catch a lot of wind, so I made it stronger by framing the entire front end with 2x4s, which doubled the weight of the framing for that wall. Had I made the front end aerodynamic, I would have felt fine using 2x2s because the wind would go around it instead of against it. Also, I would have only had 1 wall, so even less weight than my finished camper. Another positive is I wouldn't have had to do it twice. It would have been done the first time. And that extra space from having a V'd or curved front end could have had a cabinet in it. Or I could have used that space for mounting a solar charge controller and an inverter. And honestly, the camper would have looked better in the end too, the top edges of the V would have extended all the way to the corners of the roof, and that would have gave it a lot better, more professional look. So if you're going to build one, you don't have to make the front end V'd. You could go curved, but do yourself and your truck a favor and make it aerodynamic right from the start. It'll save time, money, cut weight, and add some space. I've mentioned cutting the weight down on the camper a couple different times now, and once again, while we're talking about that, I honestly don't think 2x4s are necessary for framing the roof. I do sometimes have a tendency to overbuild things, and I do that for two different reasons. The first reason is simplicity. Sometimes the easiest way is actually a bit overbuilt. And the second is I'm just not sure how well it's going to hold up. So I'll add an extra stud or maybe use some heavier materials. Honestly, both of those reasons came into play at one point or another in this build. Personally, I still would not trust building my roof with 2x2s because you do have to get on the roof. And if you live in a state where it's snowy, if you don't have something to park that camper in, that's going to have to hold all that snow throughout the winter. So I wouldn't use 2x2s, but I do think 2x3s would be plenty strong enough and cut off a considerable amount of weight. While we're talking about the roof, one other thing I didn't do, and I avoided it for I think a good reason, was I didn't install a ceiling fan or a rooftop air conditioner. My main reason for that is it seems to be a common place for leaks to start, and you do see a lot of campers that have sagging roofs and water spots and just get destroyed from a leaky roof. So I avoided putting one in. Now this coming spring, I might actually add one because those 80-degree summer nights are pretty miserable to sleep in, and either a rooftop fan to suck out all that hot air and really get it circulating, or a rooftop air conditioner would make it a lot nicer. The next thing I want to mention was pointed out to me by a lot of people in the comments, mostly mechanics. Apparently these connectors are junk. They fail all the time. And I didn't realize that. The original pop-up wiring was totally filled with them. To me it seemed like a pretty easy solution to connect a wire midway to another wire. A better choice would be solder and heat shrink anywhere outside. On the inside, you could use Wago connectors. They seem to make a really good connection and hold on tight. Either way, don't use these connectors. Apparently, they are garbage. My final thought is on this diesel heater. It seems to have quite a mixed bag of reviews. The most common complaint is the fuel pump is too loud. Me personally, I didn't think it was that bad. I mounted mine outside. It makes some noise and you can still hear it, but honestly, it kind of sounded like having a metronome running in the background while you're trying to sleep. Really didn't bother me that much at all. I would say do yourself a favor, go to the auto parts store, get some good fuel line. This stuff is really flimsy, it's hard to connect to the fittings, and it's probably not going to last as long. The one thing I wish I would have known was they have different controls for them. The one I bought, it just adjusts from low to high. They have some that have thermostat controls, and that would have been much, much nicer. There was one night I was camping with it. It was mid-20s overnight. It was nice and warm inside, so I turned the heater down, went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night just dying. It was so hot in there because it never shuts off. It's just low and then a couple steps up to high. So my advice is get one with a thermostat control so you can actually set the temperature that you're comfortable in and have a good night's sleep all the way through. And if the fuel pump's going to bother you, look on YouTube. There's hundreds of reviews, hundreds of people changing the fuel pump out. I'm sure you'll find a quiet one you can replace it with. It doesn't bother me personally. The biggest thing for me was the thermostat. I've put 4 of my camper build videos up on the screen here. If you want to see the entire process for the white one and the build process for the little one. Thanks so much for watching, and I really hope this helps you avoid mistakes that I've made. I'm just sorry it took so long for me to make this video. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.